Do you see the recording button? Okay,
Oh,
yes. Yeah. Yep, I
right.
do see.
Yeah.
So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining our session today. Thank you for being a member of Women Who Code Silicon Valley and attending our events, all these virtual events which we are bringing for you to be active and to have your skills upgraded in this time of pandemic. So today we have Nirmal with us, who is going to teach us, who is going to tell us tips and tricks about how to go about learning for interviews and how to be prepared for them, as well as how to timeline your interview when you are in an actual interview. So just a few tips and tricks from him, and let's get started.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Akanksha. Thank you for organizing this. And I've done a few of these, but this is my first event with Women Who Code. So I'm really happy to be here, and it's amazing to see that you've assembled quite a large crowd here. So I'm also very happy to share this with everyone and make it as useful as it can. And thanks for organizing this, and I'm happy to do this again if there's people who want to, people who missed it, or you want to do a repeat of this. So just happy to do it again. So with that, let's begin. Cool. So my name is Nirmal, and basically I call this presentation optimal timelining. So by that, what I mean is, how do you think about that space of 45 minutes in an interview, and specifically for a data structures and algorithms interview? And I feel that, just thinking about this in a systematic way, like arriving at this as a structure is quite helpful. So these are some of the kind of ideas that I have built over a few years, and I have a worksheet that I use to test myself how I am adhering to the structure. And those worksheets, I've shared those worksheets in the chat, and we will go over what those worksheets mean. Yeah, so let's start. So basically, the agenda for this talk is that I'll speak a little bit about this presentation and myself. We'll talk a little bit about what the optimal and non-optimal interviews look like. And so I've spent some time, interviewing and taking interviews, as an engineering manager or building out a team. But I've also been on the other side where I've been doing interviews for, looking for opportunities. So I've had a good sort of gut feeling of what optimal and non-optimal interviews feel like. And then the bulk of this presentation, we're going to spend in this idea of, how to sequence this 45-minute interview. Along with that, how do you assess yourself? And this is where the worksheets come, to continuously iterate and improve. And then we'll have some time left for any questions for me, right? So basically, this is where we'll spend most of our presentation, right? As I was saying, that this 45 minutes is something that everyone experiences when they interview for software engineering jobs. And why is it even necessary to think about these 45 minutes in these different timelines, right? Like you have all of these different colored timelines here. And the simple answer here is that, it's just always better to have a plan than having no plan, right? So this is like one of the plans of how to think about this. And yeah, this is the timeline. We'll spend most of our time on this timeline. And I just wanted to give a short view of this timeline before we begin. So a little bit about me. I've spent the last 10 years doing, software engineering here in the Silicon Valley. I've done quite a few interviews, as I have been looking for jobs. I've cracked a bunch of these interviews. And along with that, I've been on the other side of the table where I've had to hire engineers in my teams. And therefore, having a lot of interviews, taking a lot of interviews. And usually, I have my own interviewing style. I do feel that the interviews in Silicon Valley, generally in tech, are quite, there's a lot of stress and anxiety in the room. When I'm interviewing, let's say that we were doing an interview, I really do my best to make sure that the atmosphere is calm, because I like to test the candidates on, can we collaborate better, right? Because in the end of the day, we are all, you usually joining a company because you're going to work together in a team, building technology. So I like to test, on that spectrum. But that said, interviews are all over the spectrum. Like, as in my own experience, I've had like stressful interviews and I've had like relaxed interviews. So that's been sort of my experience. And for the past 3 years, I've spent some time with a couple of these interview boot camps that are in the Silicon Valley. I've just done this, volunteering my time because I've been interested in this process of what it takes to become good at interviews. So I've done a few like technical sessions on different questions in trees, graphs, but I've also spent some time on this type of topic, like systematic thinking on how to break down interviews. And basically I do this because I just enjoy this idea of optimizing things. I just don't do this in interviews. I do this with everything around me. And usually when there are people around me, I kind of drive them nuts by sharing all this stuff. So this is like an outlet for me where I come and share these things with people who want to listen. And I do it because, it's just fun, and you can kind of, it's kind of like the life hacking, right? You can life hack your way and for fun and profit. So before we begin, basically, I wanted to kind of go over what is the prerequisite. So what are we covering here? Essentially, we're talking about this average data structures and algorithms interview, right? The average interview, which happens about 90% of the time. Like usually when you go to the big companies, you have like around a full day of interviews, and maybe you have 5 interviews, of which 3 to 4 of those are data structures and algorithms, and they're roughly between 40 and 45 minutes. And we'll talk about how we can adapt this to a couple of different variations. But typically, the average data structures and algorithms interview is 40 to 45 minutes, where you're asked to write a function. Right? It's basically, they tell you like, okay, you know what, this is a input, and we want you to write this optimal function that's going to deliver some output. And that's the scope for this discussion. And what I assume that you need to have, like, there's some bit of prerequisite, right? Like you have to get to a point where sufficient amount of practice has been done. And most of you who are like career software engineers, or you've just kind of graduated out of university, you're already familiar with most of the CS 101 concepts, right? The algorithms and data structures. And then there is some bit of work that you need to do just for this process. So that work is a prerequisite, figuring all of this out. And there's various sources for these. Of course, there are all these paid products online, like Interview Cake or Algo Expert. These are the 2 that I'm familiar with, or there's a program that I'm familiar with here in Bay Area called Interview Kickstart. And then there's LeetCode. LeetCode can be kind of overwhelming. There's about like 1,400 problems there. I wouldn't encourage anyone to go and do all of those. But in LeetCode, like a little thing that I do is that in LeetCode, on the right side column, they have a few sections like the top 100 most popular problems, the top 100 Google problems, the top 100 Facebook problems. And if you do 3 or 4 of those lists, that's roughly 300, 400 problems, but they're not all different problems because there's going to be some overlap there. So roughly there are about 200 problems, and that's in the space of what you need to do to, which qualifies as good practice, right? The way that I think about this is that there are 8 different topics, like at least in my head. You have these data structures like stacks and queues, linked lists, trees, graphs, and then you have these techniques like dynamic programming, recursion, greedy problems, and then strings and that kind of stuff. So there's these broad topics, and then you want to cover these topics. If you have like 8 to 10 topics and you're doing between 20 problems in these topics, you're having some wide coverage. Sorry, yeah, there was a question. Okay, I thought I heard a question, but I'll just continue. But if you have a question, just feel free to interrupt at any point. So one thing to remember here is that you don't have to get overwhelmed with the number of, it can, I will say that it does seem overwhelming, but the truth is this: the amount of questions that you can ask in one of these interviews that can be done in 45 minutes is quite, there's only a few problems that qualify this pattern. And usually the base pattern for these problems are quite, narrow. And then there's variations of these base patterns, right? Now you could the way that I like to think about this is that if I cover sufficient amount of problems, I'm going to just naturally develop an instinct for these base patterns. And then there is the whole idea of thinking of like, hey, these are the base patterns, learn the patterns, right? So you could arrive at this practice in any way that you want. But the idea is that you have to get to this point where you have sufficient practice, right? And you want to get to a point where you're, what I say, you don't want to be anxious about coding. So by that, what I mean is that having mastery over one language, right? And by mastery, it doesn't mean that you need to be, like a world practitioner, world's best practitioner in Python or Java. You just need to be at a point where, assuming that you know the logic and pseudocode of the problem that you're trying to solve, you're confident in your skills that you can write the code for that, right? It doesn't have to be like amazing, like you're a person that can write a book on some language. That you don't have to get to that point. You just have to be at a comfortable point for coding. And the best thing about this is that everything that I'm talking here is not like a magic trick or a magic pill. What I've found is that if you do sufficient number of interviews, this process becomes quite visible to you. And I've seen this over the years where all I've done is that, I think I see this process, so I just want to encode it so I can save some time early on. So nothing special going on here, right? Okay, so let's talk about like what are these non-optimal patterns, right? These are interviews that I feel end up, not converting well for the candidates. And these are things that I've seen both, in these mock interviews that I've done for a few of these volunteering organizations, but also in real jobs. So usually what I noticed is that the candidates don't have a good understanding of the time. You want to have at least a sense of how the time is flowing. And you can be very precise with that. Some folks have a stopwatch with them. Some folks are using conversation, but having an idea of time is a valuable thing to own in the interview, right? Another non-optimal pattern is, this feeling anxious, right? And that's something that all of us feel. It's like every one of us starts with this process of feeling anxious in an interview. And what that leads to is this rush to start coding, right? You want to get to the whiteboard and start coding immediately. I feel that that's a non-optimal approach. And we're going to talk about, why you want to hold off of that and how to approach this, right? Another thing that I noticed is solutionism, or performing pattern matching early on. It's kind of like premature pattern matching. So what this looks like is early on in the problem, you might start, the dialogue starts looking like, hey, maybe this is a recursive problem, or, oh, this looks like a graph problem. So what's happening here is that before you understand the scope of the problem, you're trying to apply a pattern to it or apply a solution to it. And oftentimes that leads you into a rabbit hole that's not, very valuable, right? So this is one of these non-optimal patterns. The second, the fourth thing here is these different stages. Like I had these stages in these 45 minutes, not being sure about these stages and not being sure how to transition between these stages. Couple of examples here is sometimes you have candidates who would be like, can I start coding now, right? That's a question that comes up oftentimes in these interviews. Like they take asking for permission from the interviewer, like, can we start coding now? So these are non-optimal ideas, right? And the last one that I've noticed is trying to read the interviewer's face. And this happens a lot, especially when candidates are feeling lost. They try to look for clues by reading the body language or the faces of the interviewer. And let me tell you that different people have different expressions, right? So it's not a very valuable signal, and it's not a very reliable way to proceed in an interview. So you want to be aware of these patterns and think about how we don't want to end up in these patterns. In the end of it, what happens is that the interviewer, they feel like they've just met a job seeker, right? And there's nothing abnormal about this. The interview may not go well, but the interviewer doesn't feel that they met someone abnormal. They just feel like, okay, they met somebody who was looking for a job, and maybe they sense some of your anxiety, but they go back to their desk and they write a little feedback like, I think that he or she was a a good candidate, but the interview didn't proceed very well. So we also want to think about that. What is the perception we want the interviewer to leave with? So thinking about some of the optimal patterns. In the optimal patterns, as I was saying earlier, there is a awareness of these, of the time flowing. And oftentimes it's just quite literal. There's a stopwatch. Usually the good candidates have like a sports stopwatch where they start it before the interview, so they know, okay, I have this many exact minutes left. Or in some cases, they're using conversation, which is quite normal too. Like, just asking the interviewer, like, I just want to know what the time is, or how much time do we have left? Those kind of conversations. The other thing is, just using conversations as a hook to lead and direct the interview. So what we mean by this is that the good interviews have the candidate, using conversation as a way to get data. I'm always going to use conversation to determine the direction to go in the interview. And this is also going to help me decide how to transition, right? And we'll talk about how, rather than asking the question, can I start coding? You want to use conversational hooks to both lead and decide for yourself whether it's the right time to start coding. So this is a senior engineering mindset. How do I use questions to get data, and I'm going to make the decisions, right? So therefore, the conversation ends up being very high fidelity conversation. The conversation always feels like this is a person who's using data to make the decisions. And because it's high fidelity, the candidate also he's ready to jump onto new information when it arrives from the interviewer. Essentially, the personality feels like the candidate is both humble but decisive. Humble in the sense of willing to take any information that comes, almost ready to incorporate that into their problem solving, but also decisive in the sense of determining what the next step is. The most interesting piece here is that the coding is like a finishing lap. It feels like when the candidate starts coding, they've already won the interview. And what is that feeling that you usually feel when you're doing this? This is also something that we will discuss, right? What I noticed was that there was an interesting parallel between how some of these big stars in Hollywood, they perform their auditions and some technical interviewing. I know that this is totally like apples and oranges, but there's a very interesting video. One of my favorite actors from Breaking Bad. I encourage you guys to check it out. It's called Bryan Cranston's Advice to Aspiring Actors. So he talks about how when he would go in auditions previously in his career, he used to approach the process as going to look for a job. But eventually he learned that when he goes into an audition, he's going to give a performance of who he is as an actor. And he takes the script, right? There's a similarity between Hollywood auditioning and technical interviewing in that you are essentially giving a performance to this very stoic audience who doesn't have a lot of expression, and they just want to see your performance. And he talks about how he goes in with this attitude of, this is who I am. This is how I do my act. And here it is, right? And he walks away from that without thinking about who gets the job and what is the result of that. And that's a very powerful approach. Like, you want to apply that to your engineering career as well, right? Like, this is who I am. This is how I solve problems. This is how I take something ambiguous that you have given to me. I break it down and I solve it. And here is my solution, right? When you think about that sort of performance, then the interviewer feels like they met this problem solver. They met an engineer. Sure, yeah, you are looking for a job, but when they go back to their desk to write a little feedback, they think about the fact that they met a very articulate problem solver who would be a valuable asset in their team. And how do we arrive at giving this kind of perception? And it feels very powerful when you do that. So here is the timeline again. And what we want to look at in this timeline right off the bat is that if you look at where the coding happens, right, in this blue area here, it's almost happening towards, the 1/3, in the later 1/3 part of the interview, right? It's happening beyond the halfway point. So what we can notice here is that coding is happening much later in the interview. And so there's a lot of stuff that happens before that sets it up successfully for this coding section to be executed well enough. And the pacing that I like to think about here is that the pacing goes from medium to slow to fast, right? The medium pacing is when you start off, when you're in the scoping and brute force sections, and then you're very slow in this kind of the green section. This is the section where personally I spend a lot of time here, close to 15 minutes in this optimal solution space, what I call. And then it's very fast after this, just starting coding and walkthrough, these sections move quite fast. And one thing that comes up in these presentations is that many times, especially in companies like Facebook, I've seen that they have these phone screens where in about 45 minutes, you're expected to do 2 questions. So one question that comes up is, hey, how do I adapt this to different sized interviews? And the idea here is to use this timeline in that adaptive sense. You want to think about this timeline as a template that you can design for your success. And so you want to think, but having a template and having and understanding how much time to allocate in this template is very valuable. And this is a template for a 45-minute interview. In which case, in some cases, if you're supposed to do 2 questions in 45 minutes, you definitely want to make this much smaller. One clue that I can give you here is that in a lot of these questions, where especially on the phone screens, where you're given 2 questions in 45 minutes, it's mostly a direct and almost like there isn't a brute force approach. It's almost like, here's the question and they want to just start seeing you code immediately. But there is some bit of work in that optimal solution. So moving quickly there, prioritizing your coding there is a valuable thing to do. And oftentimes you want to understand that this is going to happen beforehand. So asking the interviewer, like, are we doing 2 questions in this interview, or 1 question is a totally fine question too. That's sometimes the recruiters will tell you that we expect you to do 2 questions. But if they don't tell you that, having that conversation early on is totally fine as well, right? So think about the timeline as a template. Okay, so let's just begin. The first 5 minutes of this template, of this timeline, is something that I call scoping, right? And what I've found is that this is the phase where the anxiety strikes, right? And the reason that this happens is that you walk into the interview, and the first thing your brain wants to know is, what is that question I'm going to get in this interview? Now, I've spent all these weeks preparing, and now I'm going to be thrown a random question. And you have this high level of anticipation. And this high level of anticipation leads to that non-optimal pattern where you want to rush in with these ideas. Like, I want to immediately try and solve this so I can get to the coding, right? And this is where you need to resist that temptation. And you can think to yourself, like, what, I'm going to spend a few minutes early on where I'm not going to entertain anything that my brain throws at me. And I'm going to simply treat this problem as a black box. By that, what I mean is that you don't think of how the box works. You don't think of the solution. You only think of what's entering into the box, what are the inputs, and what is the box going to output. That is your, the result of this function. And usually most questions in these interviews, so they have some examples to them, so that the interviewer might throw a question at you with some strings and be like, what, here is an example input. This is what the output looks like. And sometimes you're given 2 examples, right? You have to pay attention to those examples as much as the question. There's a lot of value, and there's a lot of value in these examples. You have to understand these examples to a point where you look at the inputs and you quite literally visualize what's happening to these inputs and how they transform into the output without thinking of the solution, right? So what I mean here is that you want to imagine what is going on with these inputs. Like, this is an input string. There's a certain number of characters here. How are these characters shifting? Like, for example, if we're talking about a string question, right? And paying attention to these examples is very valuable in this phase. It might be necessary to make your own examples. And this happens if you are given only 1 example or 2 examples. And a common mistake that I've seen when you're making your own examples is making overly complicated examples. You have to practice, in your practice, you want to practice making small, good examples. The small, good examples are examples that are mostly targeting these positive cases, right? You want to resist that temptation of throwing too many edge cases or too many different conditions in your examples. So spending some time, in your practice, building nice looking trees, nice looking graphs that make positive outputs. By positive, what I mean is they're not the edge cases or negative kind of conditions, which you want to think about. All of the complexity. You want to solve these little happy examples before going ahead with these complicated examples. Right? So practicing this is very valuable. And or in this phase, right, the goal is you want to get as much information about how that solution behaves, as opposed to thinking about what does the solution look like, or why does it work optimally. That stuff can wait. You simply want to look at the solution, how it behaves under different inputs and outputs. And after these 5 minutes of scoping, the best thing to do next is to just brute force the solution, right? And this is a easy win. This is really good for your nerves, because you can throw up something bad that works up there, and something bad that just looks that it can be solved with a few loops, double loop, triple loops, exhaustive searching. So you can just throw these brute force solutions out there, and it gives you both the satisfaction and the interviewer a feeling that, okay, I'm speaking to somebody who has already arrived at a bad solution that can work. And the nice thing to do here is to actually spell out that complexity. We do want to talk about, okay, this is an n square solution, or this is a quadratic solution. And you also want to declare, vocally, that we should try and improve this, that we want to search for a better way to solve this. And that's about it. You don't have to code the solution. You don't even have to whiteboard it. If you can verbally spell this out, this can be done in less than 5 minutes. Like 5 minutes is a lot of time here, but it can be done easily in like 2-3 minutes, especially because you've spent 5 minutes just looking at all these examples and scoping the problem, right? And the goal again here is get a quick win. It's a nice feeling to get a quick win and to say that, this is how bad this solution is. Okay, and so this is your medium pace, right? You've now arrived at what I think is the hardest phase of this interviewing, right? This optimal solution almost feels like a little bit of a dark art, because you're going to have to rely on some of the instincts that you've built in your practice. All of those weeks that you spent solving problems, your instincts are going to drive you in the right direction. And this is where, getting into the wrong rabbit holes and understanding how far you want to persist in this rabbit hole, these are the instincts that you want to build upon. Because if you think about it, there's not a lot of time to explore many different approaches here, right? So how do you go about making sure that you don't end up too far into the wrong rabbit hole, and and you approach this properly? And the first thing is that you want to go very slow here. This is really slow. And the goal, the way I like to think about this, is that you want to make what I call small and incremental good decisions, right? So, and this often looks like just speaking aloud to yourself, right? And not reaching too far. By reaching too far, it feels like you're making a lot of guesses, like asking questions like, maybe this is a dynamic programming. That's reaching too far, right? Small decisions and good decisions that are incremental will try to ask questions about why a certain brute force approach is incorrect, and you want to make this slow approaches, right? And when you do this slowly, and when you're allowed at this phase, what an interesting thing happens. Many interviewers notice this meticulous approach. They notice this earnest way of trying to solve the problem, and they like to nudge you in the right direction. And this is where you get your clues, right? This is the phase where if you're just making, sorry, was that somebody asked me a question?
Somebody is not on mute. Can
Ah,
everyone mute themselves?
okay, sorry, I thought that, yeah. So the goal is that if you make these small approaches where you're asking yourself these questions about the next best thing to do, in many cases, the interviewer will just kind of like throw a little tip at you. And this is the phase where even your brain is just going to be primed to take that in and run with that, right? Um, so once you have kind of done this, and let's say that you have arrived at a point where you have a good idea of what the optimal solution looks like, it's still too early to start coding. What you want to do at this phase is that you want to spell out the complexity of this approach. And this is where you want to get the data, whether this is what the interviewer is looking for, right? You want to get the data that is this a valuable approach? And that's going to help you decide to start coding or not, right? Like you can have this conversation with the interviewer. For example, you can say, so this is going to be a linear time O of n approach which uses constant space. Is that what you're looking for, right? And now they are in a position where they need to answer, and they might say, no, we need to do better, right? So now you have a good idea. Okay, it's O of n linear time constant space, so maybe there's a log n approach here. And this is also a valuable signal. Or they might say, yeah, this is great. This works for me. And you can declare, I'm going, okay, so we can start coding now, right? So you can just make that decision for yourself as opposed to asking them. And it's valuable to talk about complexity early on because it shows that, you are you show that senior engineering mindset, which is that, you don't need to write the code for your problem to know how good or how bad it is, right? So the ability to think about this abstractly is also, kind of showing that you are a person with that senior engineering mindset, right? And at this point, the goal would be that you take the core logic of this optimal solution and pseudocode it as much as you can. By pseudocoding this, it would mean that you want to take the entire crux of this optimal solution and just write as much as you can of how it works on the whiteboard so that it helps you in that coding phase, right? And everything that surrounds this core logic, all of the various conditions, the different cases, you want to be able to visualize that in your mind. And it's only at that point that you decide that you're going to start coding, right? So this whole process, I spent 15 minutes here, and the entire process is both getting that optimal solution, communicating the complexity, and having that pseudocode on the board, right? And when you do move to the next phase, and you have done this based on your own decisions and the conversation that you had with the interviewer, this is the coding phase. And this is what it feels like when you arrive at this phase. You should actually feel happy. It's like, sure, the interview is not over, it's 2/3 over, but you will actually feel a sense of, you know what, I know I can win this now because it's almost done. This is the last lap. And if you're feeling this, this is where, this is the sign of an optimal interview. When you start coding, it almost feels like you're just copy pasting. It feels like cheating because all you're doing is that you have this little corner in the whiteboard where you have your pseudocode, and you've just gone onto the whiteboard where you're supposed to write your code. Just top to bottom, you just banged out your code very quickly. And it shouldn't feel like you have to go and overwrite a lot of stuff. If you're doing that, then that's a sign that you didn't spend enough time figuring out all of the intricacies in the optimal solution.
Hi, Nirmal. Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. So, given that currently we are either given a Google Doc or an online coding template to write our code, so how would you recommend writing the pseudocode, given that you cannot use pen and paper or whiteboard? How would you go about that?
Yeah, so, in a Google Doc or even in a CodeBunk or any of these collab edits or any of these editors, it's valuable to, in that optimal phase, it's valuable to write down all of your observations in like a comment block or just above your code, right? Before you start coding, it's valuable to put all that stuff there. And yeah, we are in this time where all of your interviews are most likely going to be, are definitely going to be remote or going to be on a Zoom call. So it's definitely spending time in, in this non-whiteboard experience, trying to learn and teach yourself when you're practicing of how to put this stuff on a doc while communicating is something that you should do. So, but you should use the document liberally before you start coding. And if it's an editor that is already set to some language, just put it in a comment block. It's totally fine. But
yeah, I have this habit of using pen and paper to solve a problem. Looks like I need to transition to
yeah. So, that this is because this is kind of like this strange time. One of the disadvantages of using pen and paper is that the interviewer does not get to see what you're doing, right? And that sometimes doesn't work for you because they definitely you definitely want to have this kind of and I kind of go over this in the later part of the presentation. You want to have this belief or this feeling of responsibility that that the interviewer should just be able to follow every step, right? Like if they are left in the dark and they don't know what's going on, and if there's multiple minutes of that, like, oh, I don't know what they're doing, that might not work well, right? So try to make sure that you practice putting things out there.
Yeah.
And one good way to think about this is that put things out there that you can use. It's like if you can put pseudocode out there, which then you can refer and simplify your coding, it's just even more valuable for you.
Okay.
Right?
And how much of the time should be spent in communicating the answer, the solution? Because when you're thinking about a solution, you're not in the capacity to talk about it. So should this be done one after the other?
Yeah. So, okay. So communication, right? So let's say we're talking about optimal solution. Now, there's two types of personalities, right? It's valuable to know where you fit in. Like you might be an extroverted personality who's just talking all the time, right? The extroverted folks are just going to be speaking everything that's on their mind. There's a little bit of like, okay, there is a little bit of, willing to be vulnerable, right? Like I'm just going to give you what's going on in my mind, and I might be wrong about that. And that could lead me in a bad path. So you're taking a little bit of risk there. By kind of just being very vulnerable, but it works for some people because they're ready to just take inputs from the interview. Like let's say I give you some idea that is not fully formed in my mind, and you tell me no, maybe that's not valuable as an interviewer. I'm going to be able to use that. So, but if you're a person who needs to stay quiet, the best way to do this is to just declare that I'm just going to take a few minutes to think about this, right? And once you say that, you can go silent for a minute or 2 minutes. Recommendation would be that when you do come back, try to like summarize what you have found, right? You want to when you come back, you want to come back with a strong communication. But the communication channel is open all the time. By open, I mean even if you're going to spend some time being silent, you do want to tell them, right, that I'm going to spend some time, I'm going to spend some time thinking, or if you're in the coding phase, you might say, I'm going to spend some time coding here. And they know that you want your time and space. But when you do come back, you want to start talking about this stuff, right? There's no like different phases of like, now I'm going to be talking, now I'm going to be silent. You want to try and maximize as much as the communication as you can, especially now because there's a lack of face time, right?
Yeah. Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Nirmal, one quick question over here.
Yeah.
So like this is what we were discussing about, like a happy path, right? So like let's say I am given a question and I'm not able to get a clue about how the solution will look like, and I am like completely clueless. So in that case, how should I handle the situation to get a clue, or how should I start the conversation with the interviewer to handle those kind of scenarios so that I can get a clue and proceed with the solution?
So, there's various phases at this, right? So in the early phase, if we are looking at the phase where, you're just scoping the problem, right? In this phase, if you don't have, here you just want to get a good understanding of what the problem is asking, and you want to get a, feeling of what the inputs and output looks like, right? So like, let's say that you're clueless at this phase, then you want to clarify this by asking some questions like, what are like at this phase, I would assume that the kind of questions that you would have is, what are the kinds of inputs am I going to get, or how big are the inputs going to be, or given this input, what is the output, right? So I'm trying to like categorize where you might have questions or where you might feel clueless. So here you're going to have questions mostly in the kind of inputs and outputs, right? But if you're feeling clueless in this phase, which is the optimal solution phase, the best way to get clues is to as much as possible show that you're making an effort in the direction of solving the problem, right? And if you have solved the problem with a brute force method, and I feel like, if you do sufficient preparation, you shouldn't have to feel clueless in the brute force. Brute force is just like, okay, I'm going to take the inputs and I'm just going to like squeeze the output out of this in the worst possible way, right? You're just going to like iterate through it, or you're going to use anything like multiple loops and just squeeze the output out of it. I feel like that's not a phase where you should feel clueless. At least your preparation to getting there. The most clueless people, the place where people feel most lost is in this phase. Like, what does the solution look like? And here you have to, you want to approach this idea with the fact that if you communicate sufficiently and if you're making these small good decisions, then it is going to open up the channel where you will get these clues. And the best way to do this is to, rather than asking for clues directly, you want to ask questions to yourself, right? You want to talk aloud, but you also want to make these honest attempts at solving the problem by yourself, and trust that the interviewer might throw a clue at you, right? So there's definitely a little bit of trusting the process that if the interviewer is an interviewer who wants to cooperate. Some interviews are not like, I do know that some interviews are going to be a negative experience, but a vast majority of interviews are quite positive, and they do want to help you out. So believing in that, but arriving at clues by making sure that you make these decisions well enough, and then they throw you these clues, because asking for clues is definitely not a very productive way of getting them. But asking questions that can give you data which can help you arrive at the right clues is also very valuable. So learning how to ask good questions is also something that you can do, and just approaching this from first principles, like, this is the problem I'm given, this is what I'm trying to solve, and just targeting that scope is the best way to get the clues, right?
Yeah, sure. Makes sense. Yeah. Thanks, Nirmal.
Yeah.
I have one last question for you. So regarding having a brute force approach and optimal solution for some of the problems, these two can be entirely different. So not necessarily a brute force solution will lead to a optimal solution.
That's right.
So is it important to spend five minutes or any time doing the brute force approach in the beginning?
Yeah. So the whole there's a very good question, because in many cases the brute force is just it's a complete different direction from the optimal solution. But how do you know that early on, right? So it's very hard to know that early on. If you are familiar with the problem, right? Like, some problems are quite obvious what they look like, and if you're familiar and if you're confident that you can directly go into the optimal solution, I would say go for it. But you should approach that with this mindset that you've seen this question before, right? Like, if you have a good idea that this is a question that has come up in your preparation, use it to your advantage, obviously, and try to go with that idea that you still need to solve it. It's like, it's not exactly cheating, but you still need to make this working solution that has to show up on the board, right? So there's still some effort required there. And in that case, if you want to skip the brute force, you can skip it. The whole goal of brute force is that you can get a quick win, right? That's the goal here. The goal is essentially to both give you a feeling that you got this, even if it's a very bad solution, and also a feeling for the interviewer that, okay, they at least arrived at a brute force solution, right? And in some cases, just doing this is a good feeling, and 5 minutes is a way too much here. But again, This is a template that you can adapt, right? You think about this as a flexible framework.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so when you, again, so like when we're talking about like when you start coding, right, it should feel like you're really like, it should actually feel like you're cheating, because you have so much information that you have built so far, as you have so much pseudocode, and that it feels like, okay, you just like wrote, and as we were saying earlier, that confidence in your coding, it should feel like you just wrote the solution top to bottom, and maybe you glanced a little bit here and there for a few bugs, right? Maximum what you find is a few typos, maybe the if condition needs to be fixed, maybe there's a bracket missing here or there, or the equalities are a little bit incorrect, that kind of stuff, right? If there was a major logic bug here, then clearly more work should have been done in this previous phase, right? Like this is what it feels like, and it feels very smooth. And again, 10 minutes also here is quite a lot. Usually I've seen this being done in 7 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes. And sometimes folks are communicative here. Some folks are kind of just saying like, walking through the loop, and they're saying like, okay, I'm going to put an if loop here, and if this condition, now do this. And then they spend 2 minutes scribbling that piece. And some folks are just silent. And then they use this kind of this sentence like, okay, let's check if this works. That's kind of a transition into the walkthrough, right? You definitely want to do a walkthrough, but how to transition into the walkthrough is you write your code, you maybe tell the interviewer, I'm just going to look for a few errors, and you keep silent there, you kind of glance through your code, and then you declare that, okay, I'm going to check if this works, and you move into this walkthrough phase. And walkthrough, again, we spend about 5 minutes here, and the goal here is to have this unit test mentality. Like if you've done like unit testing, the way to think about that is, how do I cover every line of my code, right? And you want to hit every line. And so you want to do that using these examples. And the example that we started with in the scoping section. And you want to pick the examples that are going to hit every line. And you take the first example and you do that slowly. So you kind of like hit all of the lines that the first example is. But then you consecutively speed up the second and third example, and you talk through how these examples transform into the required output in this walkthrough. At this point, there should be no change in the complexity. That would be, again, like a very big red flag if something shifted here, right? And let's say that you were using some language library call that had like, let's say that you were doing concatenation of strings, and you should be aware of what that looks like from a complexity point of view, and it shouldn't have to change the initially stated complexity, right? So this is just something to remember. The last, yeah.
To interrupt with the question.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the walkthrough phase, I generally think about it in terms of test cases.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you do a walkthrough, you end up discovering some test cases that you probably missed out initially.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I find myself having to go back, optimize. So there's some kind of a feedback loop there, where I originally think that this is optimal solution, and then I start coding it. But then when I think through test cases, I find like 1 or 2 more additional corner cases, which need some refinement to the code. How do you see that as an interviewer?
Yeah, as an interviewer, if it is like an edge case, like let's say it was like, okay, we had to consider null strings, or we had to consider a tree with only 1 node, right? That's possible. That's totally fine if you discovered that you had to consider one of these edge case type of situations, and the solution there was to maybe just return like an immediate answer. But if it was an edge case that was quite a major edge case that revealed like a whole different case that was not even considered, then that would kind of it would not work in your favor, right? And it really depends on how optimal the rest of your solution is. And I could say that the feedback might be like, it's not going to be like 100%, right? It's not going to be 10 out of 10, but it's going to be something like, like I felt like they got it, like they were there 70-80% of the way, but there was one significant piece that they missed out. So I would say that it varies on how far you missed. Small cases are fine. Like if it was an edge case, it's totally fine to have missed that. Yeah.
Okay, so would you recommend like spending enough time like in the optimization phase to identify all possible test cases before you even write a single line of code?
Yeah, I would, you know, I would do that. And that's something that I think I have in my worksheets. It's kind of like something that you want to check as a milestone, that when you do have an optimal solution, you want to make sure that the optimal solution covers all of these examples that, you know, you have scoped out. So that's why the scoping phase is so important, where you identify all of these possible variations, right? This is why spending time in that the first 5 minutes is so important. You want to identify the entire universe of these variations that can work. So yes, I would encourage that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah.
I just have one more question. So sometimes I've found that I'm not able to reach the optimal solution, and maybe if I walk through it, that's when I find out, okay, now I've got it. So is that something that should be done?
When you I'm sorry, I don't follow. When you walk through your optimal solution?
So I haven't been able to reach the optimal solution, but when I walk through it, I can see where it is missing and then, you know, work upon it and get the optimal solution.
So, you know, I think what you want to do is that, so here is how I think about arriving at an optimal solution, right? That you definitely want to arrive at an optimal solution using this thing that, which I call is first principles, right? So how do you arrive at an optimal solution? Should you use an example to arrive at an optimal solution, or should you use certain things that you've identified about the problem to arrive at a solution, right? I think these are the two philosophies that we are probably discussing here. And the philosophy that I lean towards is that I want to identify a solution based on what I have understood about this problem, right? Like, and I want to, so when you approach it like that, you're going to arrive at an optimal solution without considering a specific example. Right? If you're going to arrive at an optimal solution using a specific example, then yes, there's going to be a high likelihood that there's going to be a blind spot somewhere, because you've essentially, you know, what they call in machine learning, you've essentially have a very tight fit on your solution, right? You've just like, you have built your solution just for this example. You want to avoid that. So you want to think about problem solving in this phase of understanding the problem, and that is where it is valuable to consider these inputs and outputs and examples. And then how do you take that and transform it into, like, what are the principles that we need to uncover to solve this problem, right? And this is what, you know, again, like going back into this optimal solutions phase, this is where everything that you spent, all the time that you spent, and this is also why brute force is kind of important, because brute force teaches you how specific examples are transformed. But all of the learning from brute force then translates into asking yourself these questions, like, you know, what happens when we take this input? Why do we need to, you know, to perform this brute force operation on this input? And then you arrive at these core insights that are just generally applicable to a wide variety of inputs. You don't want to, you know, think about optimal solutions as a walkthrough. Optimal solutions feels like a very first principles problem solving approach.
That helps. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, is there a question?
Yeah, if I could, at what point should you consider the edge cases in all of these phases? Like if, like I think someone just discussed, if you discover it in the latter stages, then it could actually maybe impact your code. So at which point is it, would it be ideal to consider the edge cases, right in the beginning or later on?
So, so typically, when you let's say that you arrive at the core logic of your optimal solution, and you know, you understand what the complexity of the solution is, this optimal solution of it, and then you put down the pseudocode on, you know, on your editor or on your whiteboard, you put it down there. The optimal solution should be applicable to, you know, most of your inputs. Now, at that point, you do want to think about what's going to happen to the edge cases. And in most cases, the edge cases are always going to have a very simple resolution. It's either going to be a specific step that you need to perform at the optimal solution, right? Like there might be something like you need to perform one extra check in this phase, or it's going to be something that you do early on. Like if it's like an empty input or it's a very long input, then you just have to do something before you even start computing your optimal solution. So, but considering how your optimal solution works on both edge cases and all the other inputs is something that you should do in this phase, as opposed to maybe discovering it later in the walkthrough. But as we went over, if in the walkthrough you discover a minor edge case, that's totally fine. I don't think that that's going to count negatively. It's only if you missed a major entire variation of the inputs. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so basically, you've done your walkthrough, and the last 5 minutes, I usually call this a buffer space. And this is something that you always want to remember, that you have this space if you want to use it. It's not necessary to leave this space for having these conversations. But let's say that you do end up having 5 minutes and you've solved everything and you've finished everything. Then basically in this phase, you do want to kind of take the opportunity to give that impression, right? This interesting impression. And I feel that quite a few candidates, they feel shy about, maybe not expressing enthusiasm about the company or the product or the team. And it is valuable to do that, because everyone wants to get a sense of why you want to come and work here, right? And having an interesting view there, and having a genuine view there, right? You don't want to also make up something that seems fake, but you do want to have a genuine point of view. And maybe you got that by reading something about the company or the blog, or maybe the interviewer that you're meeting is somebody who has done something in the community, and talking about that. That's not flattery. It's people like to hear about the fact that other people recognize their work. So this is always valuable. And if you do it in a genuine way, it always leaves like this interesting impression, right? And they go back with this feeling that they met a problem solver who's also very enthusiastic to join them. And yeah, so you want to use this space in that way. And of course, you do want to spend a lot of time asking questions, and your questions could be, a variety of questions. Maybe you're curious about the engineering stack, about what their week looks like, about how work gets done. There's definitely some questions that you don't want to touch on, right? You don't want to talk about like, questions like, what is the, like one question that I don't want to talk about is work-life balance, because I feel like I can get that information, I can get that data by looking at, things like Glassdoor, or, there's a couple of forums online like Blind, where you will get data from there. And of course, it's valuable to take all of that data with a grain of salt, right? But I feel like asking those kind of questions to an interviewer is not particularly valuable for your case. You always want to make sure that you're optimizing this for a win for yourself, so that eventually you end up in a position where you have multiple wins and you can make the best choice for yourself, right? So always trying to play this to your gain is just better, right? So always trying to optimize this for a win is better than trying to cover your bases like, hey, are you guys working on weekends? You can definitely find that out. I feel like you can get a good sense of the company's culture by just reading the right sort of forums and things like that. So a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. I think we went over these, some bit of these, right? So I talk about this idea of communication. You have this introversion and extroversion, and it's definitely valuable to know where you lie in this spectrum, and understanding how to use this. You want to stay in a comfortable space, but realize that having this notion that you want to have this notion. This is something that at least I carry personally in the interviews. I carry this notion that I want you, the interviewer, to know what's going on in my mind at all times. And it's my responsibility that you understand everything that's going on in my head, just because I don't want to leave you in the dark, right? And I found that that works pretty well for me. And so you want to kind of understand where in the spectrum you lie. And if you're slightly introverted, you want to ask for that blank space or that silent time. But when you come back, make sure that you're coming back with a at least like a valuable summary of what you did in those few minutes, right, of staying silent. The other thing that I think about is that effective interviewing is a lot about understanding all of the things that you can control, because there's that phase of optimal solution, which is the only phase which is quite fuzzy, right? That is the phase where all of your instincts and problem solving skills are going to be required to give you this magical moment, like, okay, this aha moment, right? But all the other variables are things that you can control, and having very strong ideas about what the whiteboard should look like. And the way that I think about this is that I think about the whiteboard as a space where after the interview, the whiteboard needs to look a certain way when I'm done. And so because I have this terminal view of the whiteboard, I start using the whiteboard appropriately early on. I might use the whole whiteboard early on, but because my mind has already decided what the whiteboard should look like at the end of the interview, it moves things appropriately in the process. And so, I mean, an example of this is that you have a whiteboard or you have an editor, and you can think of it like, okay, in the top left 75% of the whiteboard, I'm going to have my code. On the top right, I'm going to have the examples. Below that, the pseudocode. Below that, the walkthrough. And in the top, in the bottom left, I'm going to have the complexity. So having these opinions.
Okay, I don't have green salsa today. Give fast, Sally.
Oh,
but we can make it.
Yeah, Emma, you're not on mute.
Hi, can you please be on mute?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So thank you. So having having these opinions and trying to control these elements of the interview is always going to play in your strengths, because these are these things that can throw you off if you don't think about them in advance. I once met somebody who actually carried their own markers and erasers, and I asked them, like, why did you do this? And they told me, like, sometimes you end up in interviews where they don't have the eraser in the room, or the markers are not good enough. So I don't want this to throw off my performance, right? I lose a few minutes here and there. So it's totally fine to be extremely precise in these kind of elements, right? And that's something that we all go through when we start interviewing. Little things like the traffic, or where you parked in the campus, or finding the room where you're supposed to do your interview. All of these little things are going to come in your way, and you can't control that because every interview is going to be in a different location. So trying to orient yourself by saying that, I'm going to control as much as I can is very valuable. Managing the clock, as I said, some folks are wearing stopwatches and they're starting the stopwatch, and some folks are using dialogue, so it really depends on how you want to make a decision there. Using specific language abstractions and libraries. If you do these, make sure that you have, kind of done them in your practice, and bring them up if you do. It's important to bring this up. Like, okay, I'm using this specific library function. This is the underlying complexity. Stating that is important. Okay, so assessing yourself. I have dropped a couple of worksheets, right? So let me just kind of go through what these look like. There's two worksheets here, and I have made, both of them are the same. And, I would appreciate, I would say that, use whichever one you're comfortable with. But I'm just going to briefly go through what the differences are. This was the first version of the worksheet that I made, and I made this just for myself. I kind of call this a self-assessment scorecard just for me. And it's kind of, the goal here was, can I make a one-sheet scorecard for myself to assess, am I hitting all of these milestones, right? Everything that we spoke about. And so everything that we spoke about, I've written out here, and these are like little check boxes, like, okay, I arrived at a brute force. Okay, I described the complexity. I communicated the time complexity. So this kind of stuff is mentioned. And because I started sharing this, I kind of like had these details. I have like flip over for detail. So everything that we've discussed is also, specified in detail on this self-assessment scorecard. So you can take a look at this, and if this is useful, you can use this. But these days, I like the second version of this, which I call the worksheet. And the worksheet is interesting. It's the same idea. It's just much broader in spectrum. And you use this as a way to assess yourself. And everything is explained what happens in each of these phases. But what I also have here, there's a little bit of more details here, like for the scoping input output, I have a few interesting cases, like if applicable, arrived at outputs for single input. So this is where, some of the questions you guys asked me about, like edge cases. So these are some nice ways that you can check that you have, arrived at the right edge cases. Like in some cases, you have to consider empty inputs. In some cases, you have to consider large inputs, that kind of stuff, right? In this worksheet, I do have something called red flags. And the way to think about red flags is that it is okay to have a few red flags in these assessments, right? Like if you're going to use these sheets and you tick a red flag here and there, it's fine, right? Like, let me show you maybe one example. This red flag in brute force. The interviewer thought my brute force solution was the eventual solution I was proposing. If this happens once, it's fine. That's it. You can tell yourself that, what, this is not my fault. It was the interviewer who made this incorrect, assumption. But if this is happening multiple times, then there's something wrong here, right? So this is how you want to think about red flags. Red flags is a way for you to notice the incorrect patterns that are emerging. And if there's too many of these happening repeatedly, then you need to start paying attention, right? So that's the nice thing I like about this worksheet. So I've described most of this stuff, and maybe you'll find a high level of detail in this. And I would encourage, if you find this presentation valuable, then I would encourage that you take these worksheets and start kind of using them in your practice sessions, right? Like maybe you have practice sessions at Women Who Code, or maybe you're doing mock interviews online at various different platforms, and start using these and ticking them off, because these are the variables that you can control, right? This is where you start getting data on yourself. And so that kind of brings me to my point of, how to iterate and improve, right? So you want to have this idea that you want to debug yourself, right? Collect as much data as you can on what your specific issues are. And you will notice that, you will notice that once you get this visibility on your specific issues, you can start targeting them very precisely, right? And so I had some very specific issues of, blanking out in certain phases. And I started asking myself, why was that happening? But the idea is that first start collecting this data, right? Eventually, what you want to do is that you want to have these core principles in your mind, because how do you remember all this stuff when you go in an interview, right? In the end, everything needs to be distilled down to a point where you just have to remember 4 or 5 points, and this whole process of timelining becomes very mechanical. It becomes like ingrained into you. It's almost like muscle memory. And so some of my core principles were, I always want to have this senior engineering mindset. I'm going to use conversation to get data, and I'm going to drive the interview. And this other thing that I mentioned, that I'm going to walk in to the interview with this idea that it's my responsibility that you understand everything that's going on. Hyper awareness of my tools like the whiteboard, tracking the time. And one thing that I find valuable to me was being patient and having trust in myself. And this is going to be hard initially, right? Because every time you're going to try and apply some system to this process, it's going to be hard for you to realize that this may work for you. So initially, you might have to give yourself some extra, patience and trust. But if you see the system working for you, then you'll begin to realize that, okay, you'll begin to get all of this data, and then this level of patience and trust, you can start like reducing that, and you might get faster. The other thing that I remember is that every time you get anxious in an interview, the biggest reason is because you don't know what to do next. And that's one of the things that I'm also trying to solve with these worksheets, is that what can we do to make sure that you know what the next best thing to do is? And that's essentially the solution for reducing anxiety, right? And to take that idea forward, if you can just make small wins, then basically a series of these small wins. It's okay if you have a small failure here and there, but a series of small wins is a big win. And so these are some core ideas that I remember. And yeah, so I mean, that's basically my presentation. So I know we went over a few questions, but I'm happy to take some more questions at this point. And you can also email me and keep in touch. And and I'd love to know if these worksheets help some of you folks. I do know that it did help some folks that I shared it with, and they were able to get into some nice companies. So I am curious to see if this is something that, did I unlock the secrets of technical interviewing? I'd like to know. So, but I definitely use something like this, and yeah, and I'm happy to keep in touch to know if this is working out for any of you. So, any questions for me at this point?
Hi, my name is Dipali.
Hi.
I just would like to say that it was a great presentation and very good tips.
Oh, thank you.
I want to know, like, how much of time, like in a day, or how much effort do you really need to put in trying to practice your problems, the practice problems as such?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, right? And so, given that most of us who are like, especially if you're a career software engineer already and you're trying to move, yeah, there's not a lot of time, especially if you have family. I would say that targeting between 1 hour to 2 hours maximum in a work week is valuable, and maybe more on weekends. You want to like give yourself enough space of like at least 2 to 3 months of preparation. And here's like a couple of ways that I think about this, right? Like, and I haven't done presentations on these, but these are some things that I'm thinking of. I'm really just thinking of putting all of this stuff on a website so it's just available to everyone. But basically, you want to, the key to effective practice is two things. Okay, one is that you want to make sure that you're having fun with it, because if you're not having fun, and a lot of this stuff is so it feels like a lot of extra work, and if you already have a full-time job, now there's this extra studying that you have to do. So you want to ask yourself really how you can make this fun. The second thing is that you want to track yourself, right? And so tracking yourself, the way that I did it is that have a big spreadsheet in which before I even started my practice of 2 to 3 months, I have all of these different topics and questions, right? Like we discussed, like, okay, maybe you're going to do 150, 200 questions over 2 to 3 months. You want to put these in a spreadsheet, and you want to make sure that you track how well you're getting through these questions, right? And you will spend maybe multiple passes over these questions. So I had different columns for, did I understand this question? Maybe the first time I took a really long time to solve it, but the second time and the third time I got faster. Tracking is very valuable because it also gives you this visibility of progress. If you don't have that, then there's a lack of motivation. But when you see these things visually in a spreadsheet and you see yourself making progress, then you are also motivated. How to have fun, right? Like the way that you want to have fun is this, right? I think that, and this is my personal opinion, I feel that a lot of the interviewing preparation is approached in the mindset of preparing for an exam, like when we were in school and university, right? Because it feels like, okay, you're being tested. So you approach this with this idea of, I'm going to go into the room and I'm going to be asked a question, and they're going to check how I did on it. And so you always approach this with this idea of like, this is a question that I need to learn, and I should be able to come up with this on my own. And when you practice also, you do that. I would say that I find that approach quite non-fun, but also didn't find it very effective. And what I did was that I spent some time, looking at these competitive programmers on TopCoder and things like that, right? These are guys who are solving these kind of problems, and sometimes harder problems, just for fun, because they want to, be on these leaderboards. And I noticed that they had a very different approach of teaching themselves these things. They approached it in a way, like a game. They would always look at how somebody else solved the problem, and they wouldn't try to arrive at the solution on their own, like an exam. they would actually spend a lot of time with the solution. They would be like, why did the solution work? What was this major insight that you revealed that made it work? And then they kind of like, they realize that it's like this, okay, I'm going to go hunting for these aha moments, and then I'm just going to collect them in my mind, right? And so I approach my preparation like that. I call it, insight hunting. I don't spend a lot of time trying to arrive at answers in the form of an exam. What I do is that I look at a question and I spend some time understanding the question, but then I immediately spend time in the solution. I'm like, why does this solution work for this question? What was that major insight here? And for me, that's a lot of fun because, it makes parts of my brain light up. I feel like I learned something. And then the next day, I'm enthusiastic to go and learn some more. But my goal is that eventually I do want to get to a point where all of these questions that I wanted to learn, I have mastery over them, that when I look at the question, I can describe in about 10 minutes what the major insight was. What was the major logic or insight that cracked this problem. And so I don't spend a lot of this time where, you're kind of like taking this heavy load and you're trying to solve this problem by yourself, without looking at the solution, the examination mindset, right? The basic idea is this: we don't know the best way to learn, but the thing that we have realized as kind of like brain, scientists and things like that, they've realized that the brain can learn really well when the amounts of input that you increase into the brain are increased, right? So try and experiment with different learning techniques. But the goal is that, you want to make sure that you can arrive at it in 45 minutes. So start with a fixed number of questions, try to learn as much as you can in all variety of ways, how you can understand how these solutions work, but eventually make sure that you can crack them in 45 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have that template that you were mentioning, the tracking template, like available, or would you be able to share that in your GitHub?
Yeah, I could. What I could do is, I could. I mean, if you guys have the GitHub, I could just drop in the few templates. I have like about 3 different variations of those. And again, this depends on how granular you want to get to your tracking, right? Like I had a very because this is a technique like me and my wife kind of figured out. So I saw her templates; they were like super granular. Like she was tracking a lot of stuff, but I was like tracking very little stuff. So I can just put all the 3 templates on there. You can take a look at that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Only because I'll get some ideas and.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. I think it's valuable. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
So Deepali, we do have the link for GitHub, and it does have one sample of the template if you want to check that out.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. I did check the GitHub, but I maybe I didn't. I overlooked the template. I'll check it again.
You can check it and and reach out to me if you don't get the links.
Sure.
You to access them. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Nirmal, I have one question. So let's say you are in the unfortunate situation where you don't think you can crack that question. How do you make the best of it?
So, I mean, I think that it really depends on when you feel this, right? Like, this is why so here's the thing, right? Like you might, in a lot of interviews, you might get a question that you have seen before or you're familiar with it, right? And it's kind of obvious that, okay, these are trees questions, so you already have like some basic ideas of how to approach it. And in a lot of those cases, the approaches are quite simple. I think that if you end up in a scenario where you have a question that you are actually stuck, that's where it becomes very valuable to have a brute force solution outline, because it means that you have at least given some solution out there. And if you're running out of time, then yes, you must work to salvage the interview as much as you can, because it's always valuable to get to the end point with a solution, even if it's a badly working solution, and just being honest about it by saying that, you know what, this is a brute force solution. I do know that I do have a feeling that this can be optimized. There can be a better solution here, but I wasn't able to come up with it, right? So focusing with that idea that, okay, in the worst case scenario, you don't want to salvage the interview, then just throwing up brute force and coding that up is fine. But I feel if that happens like 1 out of 5 interviews in the whole day of interviews, maybe, it'll work out for you, because, the rest of the interviews will be like, hey, you know what, she solved the problem. She solved my problem pretty satisfactorily. And one person says, yeah, but she did only like brute force in mine. It could still work out for you. So always optimizing for salvaging in the worst case is good.
Thank you so much.
Quick question regarding, so if you have to engage the same approach to a phone interview, and there are 2 or 3 questions asked in 45 minutes. So where would you cut back? Like what would you, is it the unit test that you can cut back, or you just do everything very fast, or how does it go?
I think you would cut back on the walkthrough significantly, and you would also cut back on the brute force. The key thing to remember is that, let's say that, early, it's always very valuable to know beforehand whether you're going to be asked 2 questions or this is just 1 question interview, because the kind of questions that show up in these 2 questions in 45 minutes, they are often the kind of questions that they don't take a lot of time. And that itself is a very valuable signal. It probably means that, you don't have to do, there's not a major insight here. And you very quickly want to understand what's happening with the example, and start like there's almost always an iterative approach or recursive approach to these problems.
That's right.
There's not much, you don't have to go very deep on this. So that itself is a very valuable signal. And what I've found is that if I just start with the example and I start like understanding what the iterative approach looks like, then there's a quick detour into the optimal approach, and you can start coding quite quickly. And the walkthrough is also pretty quick at that point.
Okay, got it.
And oftentimes the interviewer itself, when he sees that, your first question, you're almost nearing the end, and it's like 20 minutes, they are oftentimes enthusiastic to just give you the other question. So they're like, they might themselves offer, that, okay, I think that works. Let's do a second question, right? They might self do that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Another question for you, Nirmal, if it's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So in the event that I don't know beforehand how many questions to expect, at what point do you think it's acceptable to like explicitly ask the interviewer about it?
I think initially in the first phase of the, these are good questions. So basically, when you're interviewing with a company, right, it's very valuable to understand everything about the process. And oftentimes the recruiter gives you this list, right? They're like, okay, you're going to be talking to so-and-so person. This first interview is going to be 45 minutes. Sometimes they will tell you that we expect you to do 2 questions. But if it's not clear, you want to clarify that the first thing in the interview, right? You want to, the minute you meet the interviewer, you have some introductions, you can just broach the subject by saying that, hey, right before we begin, I'd like to know if we aim to do 1 question or 2 questions. And you can say that this is because I usually pace myself. And if we are moving at 2 questions, I need to kind of like pace myself faster. And that's totally fine. But you want to bring it up beforehand. So, you have that data too.
Got it. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? I think we have covered a lot of questions. Yep, and no more questions.
Well, great. Thanks, Akanksha. And
thank you, Nirmal, for taking out time for us and giving us so much detailed information about how to track the interview and timeline the interview correctly. And I'm happy that so many members had this opportunity to listen to you and ask questions to you, their custom questions to you. So we want to thank you on behalf of Women Who Code, and we would like you to come back with more of such events and help our members with the interview preparation.
For sure, yeah, I quite enjoyed this as well, and I'm kind of happy that this was useful to all of you. So yeah, happy to kind of come up with more of this stuff and see if it helps more people. Yeah.
Yep,
but thanks for having me here, and And if you guys want to keep in touch, you can find me on LinkedIn or you can email me.
Yes. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining and asking questions.
Thank you.
Okay.
Other events. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Nirmal.
you.
It was very
Bye.
useful.
Good night.
Bye-bye.